This is Stephen K4ATZ. I figured while I'm getting a massage in my massage chair, which I do have a video on the basics of massage since I am a retired chiropractor. I think my input is pretty knowledgeable about things, massage chairs. But I've got a lot of hobbies and whatnot, but one of them is ham radio. But I'd like to discuss ham radio and prepping. One of the things going on right now, and a hit show on National Geographic, is preppers. It's very popular because, quite frankly, a lot of people are scared of economic collapse or terrorism and different serious matters that could affect our living and our lifestyle and every phase of life. So people are storing food and buying firearms and ammunition and bunkers. I mean, the show's incredible. If you haven't seen it, you really should watch it. Probably most people that are going to watch this video have seen the show. But I'd like to talk about, they mention sometimes as a problem with some of these people is not having proper communications. And they do mention amateur radio, or ham radio as it's called. Ham radio has been around over 100 years. Of course, the founder of radio frequency, radio transmission, is Marconi. And then amateur radio has always been, and always will be, primary purpose is emergency communication. Now, to participate in emergency communication is not like it was when I first became an amateur about 40 years ago, where you could just volunteer. Now, amateur radio is integrated in Homeland Security and FEMA, and you do have to have courses, everything from CPR to basic emergency courses, because amateur radio operators will be put or have to go right into ground zero, or the main area of the problem, whether it be a hurricane or tornado or, God forbid, some other kind of catastrophe. But one thing they don't say on preppers, or I've never heard them say, is, you know, ham radio is fine, but you have to be licensed to use it. So if you're a prepper and you want to get a ham radio, you can get it, but I'll caution you not to transmit until you get licensed, because it is big time fines. Go ahead and sit up here. Oh boy. Okay. Big time fines, and even in a state of emergency, where if you needed supplies or emergency, you are not allowed to transmit. It's punishable up to $10,000 and 1 year in jail per occurrence. So if you transmitted 10 times, that could be a pretty hefty fine. And nowadays, ham radio licensing does not require Morse code. They publish actual books that have a question pool. So in other words, if the test is 35 questions, which is the technician, the basic one, you'll have a pool of a couple of hundred questions, and in that pool of questions will be the exact questions and exact answers and distractors. I would encourage you to learn what you're studying and not just memorize it, because you'll be lost when you get on the air. And it's not like CB where you just plug up an antenna. There is some basic knowledge that needs to be known about frequencies and resonance of the antennas. So you can't just hook up any antenna. It has to be resonant for the frequency that you're transmitting on. And if you don't know what that means, just look it up. But in other words, the radio will not work properly. It will not work at all. In fact, you can damage the radio if you just try to transmit with any old antenna. So you hook a CB antenna up to amateur radio, it's not going to work. Now, there are things called antenna tuners that kind of will help to create the proper length for your transmitting frequency. But these resonance of the antennas can be quarter wavelength, half wavelength, full wavelength, and you'll see when you get into it in the formulas, the lower the frequency, the longer the antenna needs to be. So if you ever see a car with a very short antenna, or a police maybe with short rubber ducky antennas or short metal antennas, those are very high frequencies, sometimes into microwave. Not microwave you eat with, microwave that you transmit with. In fact, cell phones use microwave frequencies. That is one of the big controversies holding a phone up to your head, because you're frying your brain. They are microwaves. They're not the kind that supposedly heat up tissue, but the jury's still out on that. I don't think it's very good to hold those things up to your head for long periods of time. I would encourage you to use hands-free or an earphone and put the phone away from you. Even having it in your pocket or on your belt will still create the frequencies and can damage tissue. In fact, there's been some studies for male infertility and decreasing sperm count because of the situation now with men having their phones on their belt clip so much. Okay, now you'll be able to hear me without tapping and rattling because my 15 minutes is up. I need to put another $5 in the machine. So, I'll just explain some basics if you're a prepper and you want to get a ham radio. The best thing to do is to do a little research. Try to find you somebody who's licensed. They can really help you. So if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But if you find an amateur, they will be able to help educate you on equipment and the kinds of equipment and what's better, what's not. But you can get a very good used radio for it's under $500. Now, if you're a prepper, I would recommend that you get a radio that will operate on 12 volts. Most do, but one that has also a variable power output. So you can save your battery because, of course, the more power output you use, the more you're going to drain your battery. Most amateur radios run on 12 volts, but some of the equipment have special current and voltage that they will require. For example, when I first got into it, tube radios had their own power supply and it was not 12 volt. What kind of voltage? I really don't know, and it depended on the radio. There's nothing wrong with tube. The color just changed. Nothing wrong with tube radios, but they're generally not as good for emergency use unless you have a generator. And the generator can produce 110 current that you can plug your power supply to. However, if you obtain an amateur radio that's strictly 12 volt, you can hook it right up to your power. And let's say you didn't have emergency power and you needed it, you needed communication, you can hook it up to your car battery. So that's something that you have right there for emergency use, usually fully charged, but I will caution you again, it will discharge the battery and it could discharge it pretty quick. So if your car is operational, just be aware of that, because as you use your car, it automatically charges the battery as well. So, back to prepping. The first class of amateur radio license is called technician. It's an entry point into ham radio. There are only 3 classes of licenses now: technician, general, and extra. If you only get your technician, you are limited, very much so, in what frequencies you can use. You can use a lot of the VHF, UHF frequencies, which are higher. The signals will not carry as far, but it's really good for local communication, and there are usually a good many hams or amateurs or other people listening within the 50-mile, maybe maximum 100-mile radius range that VHF can communicate with. So if that's all you want, that's fine. And you can get a VHF radio, a 2-meter it's called, a used one, anywhere from $50 on up. You can get a very good one with good wattage out, like 50 watts, for about 200 bucks. There are a lot of other things you need to know about 2 meters and all how it works. Most communication on 2 meters is done through what's called a repeater. It's a machine that will pick up your signal on one frequency. It will refine it. It will change the frequency and transmit it out on another one. So for 2 meters, you usually listen and transmit on different frequencies. However, there's something called simplex, which means you transmit and receive on the same frequency. If repeaters don't have emergency power or the generators are out, that will be your only mode of communication, is simplex. Simplex is fine, but it will not go as far because repeaters are generally located in very high places like top of buildings, or for example, Stone Mountain has a bunch of repeaters on it. Police use repeaters, commercial radio uses repeaters, and hams use repeaters. But if you really want to be the ultimate prepper and you get your ham license, it is wise to upgrade to general class, because general class gives you a little bit or a good bit of all the ham frequencies. VHF, UHF, microwave, and in addition, more of what's called HF. Those are the lower frequencies. Usually those antennas are going to be more involved than VHF, because VHF you can get by with one that's about a foot, foot and a half tall, or a couple feet tall. But when you get to HF, you're talking about lower frequencies that require longer antennas. They do make mobile antennas that are shorter and that will move up and down, or that you can adjust. And they do make one called Buddy Pole, if you Google that. And you'll find that that's a very good portable antenna, but it's not as good as a quarter or a half wavelength HF antenna. So if you've ever seen the antenna that comes with your stereo, it's called a dipole. It goes up in 2-hour split going into a T. This is a very common form of antenna for HF, and the length of that will be determined by what frequency you use. But I can tell you that it would have to be at least 20-30 feet long. Some can get up to 150 to 250 feet long if you're using what's called 160 meters, or it'd be 1.8 megahertz. All right? Now, not trying to get too technical, but 1.8 megahertz is a very low frequency. If you get into something like 20 meters, which is 14 megahertz, okay, 1 and up to 14 megahertz. To give you an example, cell phones use 800 megahertz and then 1,000 or 1,200 megahertz, which is actually getting up to the gigahertz range. But we're down to 14 megahertz. The 14 megahertz, and to give you an example too, AM radio is, like say 750 WSB is 750 kilohertz. Kilo is 1,000, mega is million. FM dial starts at 88 megahertz up to 103, 105, 106 megahertz. So that's why at night on AM radio you can sometimes pick up Cuba and stations long ways away because it's a lower frequency. But when you get up to FM, you're not going to have that happen, because 2 meters, for example, is 144 to 148 megahertz, and that is right above your FM dial. Now, there's a whole nother series of like AM, FM. That's completely different than frequency. That has to do with your mode of transmission. But getting back to the HF, if you get your general class license, you will have some privileges in every ham band. The next step up is called extra, and you'll get all the frequencies allotted to ham radio operators in all the bands. That doesn't mean you can transmit everywhere, because hams have certain frequencies we can use. But extra gives you all the privileges that we are allowed to have by the international radio, whatever it's called, and the United States. Different countries have different allotments, so it will vary from country to country, and their licensing varies too. We did away, or the United States did away with Morse code, I guess 10 to 15 years ago. It's very controversial. I had to learn the Morse code, and to be honest, you can talk a lot further with Morse code with a lot less wattage. So in emergency situations, plus, let's say you don't want people to hear you talk, with headphones and a keyer, it's basically silent. But if you can listen, but when you have to talk, not only is the signal not as good as the Morse code, but people will hear you. So Morse code is an excellent form of communication, and CW is what it's abbreviated. That stands for continuous wave. And usually CW will get through when voice can't. So I would encourage hams, even if you don't learn it to get your license, take the time to learn it once you get your license, and you may find that you'll use Morse code more than you talk. In fact, when I was younger, I almost exclusively used Morse code. Now, as I've gotten older, I haven't used it as much, but I still love it. And some radios even have decoders, or they sell actually decoders. Of course, you still have to know how to send it. Well, I take that back. You can use a keyboard, but then you're defeating the whole purpose. So, if you're a prepper, look for a good used ham radio. You can get a new one, but quite frankly, you got to be careful, because just like anything else, you could buy a dud and somebody could rip you off. But if you become friends with a ham operator, they may be able to help you with this or test it or whatnot. I will do another video on some of the best brands and some of the best radios. So we will continue this in another segment. But I know it's a little confusing, and I've probably covered way too much information. But I'll try to break it down. This is just an overall topic right now to help people get started. And be honest, amateur radios had some of the highest licensing figures, numbers of new people in the last couple of years than ever in the United States, because people are smart and they're realizing that in case of emergency, when all the cell towers are down and there's nothing else, the people and the communication that still to this day gets emergencies, supplies in and out, and find people and help people are amateur radio operators.